Aloha, welcome and namaste. I'm Ravi Dass from Paia via California and India, of course, New York, and this is Mystical Maui, my interview show that brings you wisdom and practical solutions in your quest for higher consciousness and right living, to help in what we hope is a new age of sharing and compassion for the earth and each other. I know you can become something greater even today. John Welshons, also known as Ramananda, like I'm Ravi Dass, another guest who has traveled 6,000 miles to be in our fantastic Maui, is an author and lecturer with a master's in history of religions from Florida State University, and is the founder and president of Open Heart Seminars, an organization born in 1981 dedicated to enhancing spiritual education and awareness in our society. Since the early 1970s, John has spent time working with notable spiritual educators like our own Ravi Dass and Stephen Levine, and setting up lectures for people who are terminally ill, as well as those in grief. His latest book, One Soul, One Love, One Heart, The Sacred Path to Healing All Relationships, is due to be published in October 2009. God bless him, that's more than I can say for my schedule. He says his life was dramatically changed by his first meeting with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1976. A strange year. I was in India wondering where our teacher Maharaji went. Over the years, one of the main areas of investigation for John has been the grieving process. John, what happened with Elizabeth? What was the dramatical change?
Well, it was 1976, and my mother had died in 1969, and that was an era when we did not talk openly about death, and we didn't know how to relate to people who were dying. So what we did as a culture was pretend it wasn't happening. We thought the most compassionate thing we could do for someone who was dying was to pretend it wasn't happening, and to lie to them basically about their condition. And I watched my mother go through that. Then 7 years later, when I met Elizabeth, I saw in a group of 2,000 people who had gathered for a weekend seminar in Berkeley, California, that here we were talking about the one thing that no one in our culture ever talked about, and people were happy. They were smiling, and I realized that we were denying ourselves a major portion of life by pretending that death doesn't exist.
And who led you to Elizabeth?
Well, it was Ram Dass's suggestion, actually, because back around, I met Ram Dass in 1973, and he, a couple of years later, suggested that the highest spiritual practice he had ever come across was working with people who were terminally ill, which I thought was crazy at the time I heard it. But then I went and studied with Elizabeth, and then started working with Ram Dass and Stephen, setting up workshops and seminars and retreats for people who were dying and people who were working with people who were dying, and I found the same thing. It's an extraordinary path.
What was it like with Elizabeth personally? She was quite a famous person in those days.
Yeah,
wasn't she
very.
like one of the first people who really like brought out that whole death and dying? I mean,
Sure.
she was like...
Yeah, well, she was, I mean, in some sense, the first
Right.
who really, and the interesting thing about her was she was from Switzerland, so she was from another culture. and she was a psychiatrist who was teaching at the University of Chicago Medical School. And it's kind of an interesting story, but I'll shorten it. But she had a couple of students who wanted to do a project studying the psychological dynamics of people who were terminally ill. And they went to the university hospital, which had, I think, 800 beds. And they came back to Elizabeth and they said, Dr. Ross, there's no one dying in the hospital. And she said, what are you talking about? There's 800 patients there. And they said, well, we went to the head nurse on every ward and they all told us there was no one dying on their ward. And Elizabeth said, I think Americans have a problem with death. And that was around 1966, and she started this work at that point at the University of Chicago, and then released a book called On Death and Dying in 1968, which was really the pioneering work, and that was the book that contained the famous 5 stages of dying, which have become so popular.
Can you just, for the audience, repeat those? Now I remember they're really, I mean, people use that in business or something, you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah, because it's a great framework for understanding our reactions to loss and disappointment and things that we don't like. So, and I also should preface it, though, by saying that Elizabeth wrote this and published it in 1968. When I studied with her in '76, she was already saying in her German accent, I wish I had never published those damn 5 stages.
Okay.
But they are, the first one is denial and isolation. Denial of the truth and feeling alone in the world. The second is anger. The third is bargaining. And she thought it in terms of bargaining with God or the Creator or whatever we think of as the Supreme Being. If you'll change my destiny in this situation, I'll be good, basically. And that was bargaining. And the fourth was depression, and the fifth was acceptance. And so the idea was that those stages of reaction to a significant loss in life are usually present in some form or another. Now, the thing that she was troubled by was that people took those as being sequential, you know, so what their understanding was, well, I go into denial and isolation, and then I go into anger, and then I go into bargaining. It's not like that. It's in and out of all of them.
I thought it was sequential too. Oh my God.
Well, because they're written 1 through 5.
Oh,
so
see, we're like what do you call that?
Linear.
Yeah, but I mean this kind of training Americans get. It's like, is that behavior? What do you call that in psychology? That, you know, the 1 through 5, and you can't deviate from that.
You can't deviate.
Yeah. I mean, I've been through, like, you know, these trainings at IBM, and I thought I was so creative and hip, and I was these things where everybody who figures this out sit down, and I ended up as the last one standing up, and I'm supposed to be the one who's so loose.
Right.
It's like, weird. But anyway, you know, you have traveled extensively in India. You have nearly 30 years of experience in meditation practice.
Coming up on 40. Actually, 40 this year.
Yeah, so I'm like going to say, I got 30 years in, you know, my old business career, and you've got 30 years, you know, doing meditation and experience. But I mean, we all kind of started in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
You also have this 25 years of business experience, 15 years of which you spent as president of a New Jersey company.
Right.
What was, you know, what was that all about? It's kind of, that makes you about 90 years old, I think.
Well, I feel a lot older than that. But,
I mean, I don't know how you crammed that. And I think only East Coast people could do that.
The business was my family business. It was my father's business. And it actually was a cemetery company, a company that managed 2 large cemeteries in New Jersey. And I had worked in it a little bit between undergraduate and graduate school. My father always wanted me to take over. And I had no interest in it at all. But when he died in 1983, I'd already been working with Ravi Dass and Stephen, and my sisters turned to me and said, "You've got to run the business." And I said, "I don't think so, not me." But I finally agreed. I said, "I'll do it part-time for 6 months." And it wound up being full-time for 12 years. So then I added another 3 years that I had spent there in the middle of graduate school, and that came out to 15 years of my life doing that.
Well, you've got quite a well-rounded, you know, business. I mean, even the cemetery, meditation, and healing, and death and dying. I don't know if they make people like you a lot. You know, I mean,
it's a pretty varied resume.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of like you can deal with so many situations.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, you find it, like believe it or not, I find it helpful that I was at IBM
Sure.
doing what I'm doing now, even though some people go, oh God, the guy's an old dinosaur, he was at this IBM.
Right.
But I am using so much experience now. I'm wondering, I says, nah, I don't even think Maharaji sent me there deliberately.
Right.
So, I mean, you can't, you know, like in 10 years ago, we said, oh, he worked. Oh, we don't like John. He worked even.
Right.
But now it's like he worked in a cemetery. He was the CEO, and he, you know. So it's like maybe you think things are coming around differently. Are you putting all this because you have your own? I mean, you have a kind of a company now, not for profit, and you do that. Do you find all that experience like helpful?
Extremely helpful. Yeah, and I guess if I were to pick one thing that was most useful, it would be the understanding of how our economic system functions. You know, a lot of us in the 60s were dismissing capitalism and dismissing our governmental system. And I remember when I went to India in '73, it was the middle of the Nixon administration and the Vietnam War. And I thought, I never want to see the United States again. The United States is evil.
I had that feeling myself.
Really?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Even before. Yeah.
A few months later, flying back from Bombay to New York, as the plane was landing at Kennedy Airport, I looked out the window and saw the eastern end of Long Island, part of New York State. And I had never been so happy to see anything in my life, you know. So that changed my perspective. And then the business, you know, I remember saying to my dad back in the 60s, when I was a wild hippie, you know, and I said, we should just shut down General Motors. Of course, I was being prophetic, I guess, but, you know, and my dad looked at me, my dad had been a businessman all his life, and he said, do you know how many people work for General Motors? And I said, no. And he goes, you know, a few million. Where are they going to work? And it was an interesting question because, you know, I think that sometimes we don't see the connections between our ideological philosophies and the reality of everyday life of average, normal human beings putting food on the table for themselves and their families. It's a struggle. And then I remember during my years in business, which I was a very reluctant businessman, but I did it. And one of my business friends said to me, he was all upset about something the government had done, and he said, I don't think that anybody should be allowed to be in government unless they've had to make a payroll.
Yeah.
You know, and that's an extraordinary thing. When we sold our company in 1996, we had 75 employees, you know, and you think of the average person who is maybe supporting a family of 4 or 5 people, and I felt every week that I was supporting a family of 75 people, that what I did was seeing to it that there was a paycheck for 75 people every week, and that our customers were being served properly, and that we were treating people with compassion. That we were helping to alleviate the suffering of the experience that they were having, which was usually the death of someone they dearly loved. So it was an interesting experience at many levels.
I want to get to your book, but I just want to make a comment because, you know, in this kind of doom and gloom economy we're having now, I had a good friend, she's a lady friend, and she called me this morning and said, hey, guess what? I wanted to tell you, I'm going to open a cafe and restaurant. And it's like, great, somebody's doing something. We can't all sit around and go, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I have a friend, lives in back of me in like kind of this duplex. They're buying a house. Of course, they got a good deal, but they're buying a house. And I love to hear stories like that. And I'm like going full blast out on my TV show and trying to get a book published, and you're doing things. So yeah, there is hope. We got to keep living, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, John is an author and a very good writer. So we're going to get into some, you know, really good stuff. So let's talk about one soul, one love, one heart, the sacred path to healing all relationships. How do you heal relationships? Why are we all in this mess? 50% divorce rates in the U.S., maybe hardly any in India, right? We always talk about India. And please don't ask about my divorce or relationships, by the way. I'm just kidding. Maybe I can get some good free advice.